I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Margaret Hagan from the Stanford Institute of Design. She's director of the Legal Design Lab, and she has been a fellow at the design school from 2013 to 2014, when she launched the program for legal tech and design, experimenting in how design can make legal services more usable, useful, and engaging. Now, Margaret has also made a very important and valuable contribution to the summit as a member of our advisory committee. And I would just like to take the opportunity to thank and acknowledge all the members of the advisory committee, because we could not have put this summit together without help from all of you. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our partner organisation, PillNet, who also has made an extraordinary contribution to organising the summit today. So thank you to all of you who have contributed to organising today's event, and especially Margaret, who had many fantastic ideas which have really helped to make the day a great success so far, and I'm sure the rest of the day will continue to run just as well as this morning. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Margaret from the Stanford Institute of Design. Thank you, Margaret. And Lisa and I are going to sneak into the audience this time so we can see the slides, because we really felt we were missing out sitting there. But we'll come back up on stage to facilitate the questions at the end.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'll talk for a little bit, hopefully leave plenty of time for questions and answers. Before I get started, I would love to see a show of hands. So how many people here work in legal aid groups, civil society, providing direct services or other policy work in legal aid? How many are more technologists, designers, people building new systems? How many are law firm lawyers or pro bono coordinators, academics who are studying or working in this? Other types of folks who I didn't mention? Who are you? Tell me, shout out. Regulators, terrific, welcome. Please tell me.
Humanitarian world, UNHCR.
Aha, okay, great. International organizations, regulators. Anyone else besides those? Yep, please. Say again? Ombudsman, all right, terrific. And just for a clear show of hands, how many people are licensed to practice law in this room? How many are not? Okay, great. All right, just helpful for me to know who I'm speaking to. So I'm Margaret. I work at Stanford at the Legal Design Lab, which is mainly an organization born out of my own frustrations with law school and the prospects of becoming a lawyer who was interested in creative ways to address access to justice problems. So this lab works at the intersection of the law school, the design school, and computer science, machine learning, NLP. Our focus is about creating these new types of interventions that will make the justice system work better for people, and testing them out, getting empirical evidence about what types of interventions are most likely to serve people better in this near future of more digital, online, and tech-enabled justice. But after 6 years of working in this space, I'll talk a lot about my frustrations and some of the fail points in our growing community of labs, innovators, innovation units. A lot more people are interested in working in the same way of making better technology, making better service designs, making better policy in civil justice. But the main thing I want to emphasize today is the need for a better network, that we are more strategic about the outcomes that we are aiming towards and how we share best practice, that we are more coordinated so that we are not in a Groundhog Day of creating and recreating the same types of apps or systems, and that we're more effective and we're gathering more data about how effective we are. So there's three main charges, not in the criminal sense, but more in that kind of graduation speech kind of sense of we as a community, can we come together? And there are three main things that I think are current gaps, are current fail points in the access to justice innovation system. And I'll go through each of those and talk about some opportunities, some stories, some ways that we can do better. The first one is about kind of the My Brilliant App syndrome, where we have a large compost heap of promising new document assembly tools, diagnostic tools, form creation tools that might have promise but are not actually that effective. Second is how we can get away from building new websites, creating new forms, creating new services that aren't actually what people want to engage with, that it's not in part of their trusted community, and how we can change our strategy about where we're deploying our resources. And the third big point is about linking up program innovation, tech innovation, with policy innovation. So for each of these, I'll tell you some stories and some hopeful points along with my small indictments about our current network, but hopefully it's on the whole positive. I'm American. And I just want to say I'm speaking a lot from the US point of view. I'll try to temper that, but hopefully in Q&A we can hear more perspectives than just my limited US one. So before I get into those three charges, I just wanted to put a baseline of what this growing network is for those of you who don't identify as part of the access to justice innovation community yet. So there's a large number of people, everywhere from chief judges down to frontline staff and clerks, to university academics like myself, and those who work in legal aid and who are students, who are all really interested in civil justice reform and about making things, not just writing reports or studying how the civil justice system is dysfunctional, but really thinking about innovation and making new things. So this combination of this lawyerly or legal scholar vision of how do we make a system that's more equitable, accessible, and just is linking together with the designer's or technologist's obsession with making better services and systems, where the metrics are about usability, engagement, and utility. And we see there's a lot of links. The world of design and the world of law, we're both problem-solving professions. We want to make systems that work better. And we see, this is just my own personal network of where I see labs and innovation happening. So anywhere from Uzbekistan to Melbourne, to Bogota, to Guatemala City, to California, to New York. There are a lot of university labs, court labs, other people who are trying this kind of more tech and design approach to increasing access to justice. And I'm sure there's a lot more points to put on that map that are not part of my own personal network. But we see this energy, especially over the past 3 years in a concentrated way, this new kind of lab energy to experimenting and trying out new justice innovation solutions. And when I talk about a design approach, really I'm thinking about these three kind of fundamental ways of working. One is about working alongside the community that you're trying to engage or serve. So instead of having a typical kind of government innovation or legal innovation session of a bunch of smart licensed lawyers in a room mapping out what the perfect system will be, how do we go alongside the folks who are actually trying to get in the door, to understand their claims, to navigate the system, and listening to their needs and their behavior, just as Dame Hazel was mentioning, to make sure that we're building systems that they can actually use, understand, and deploy. Also, can we actually build systems alongside with them? So rather than just talking to people up front or doing user testing with them, how do we make them part of the decision-making and prioritization when we're doing this creation? And the final main part of a design approach is this commitment to experimenting and iterating, echoing back to earlier. How we have this commitment to testing and improving and not just assuming that because we built something, it's great, we're smart, it will work, case closed. So in this world of design, we think about many different types of ways that we can make things, many different types of interventions that we could put into the civil justice system to improve it. Anything from better communication design, so the types of ways we lay out information on a website or on an official paper from the court, to new products, new types of apps or tools we can put into use, new types of services where we coordinate a journey for a person, to changing the fundamental organizations and policy and rule structures, the regulations of the legal system itself. And so we see a very wide, all those points on the map, there are people who are working on design and innovation in many different levels. But my main indictment is that I think we are often stuck in a Groundhog Day loop. And this is partly because of where this innovation is happening. Because of the lack of resources, or often because it's university-based or with teams that are fleeting, we're always starting over again from day one, from point zero. And this is my own reflection on how my own lab has worked, is because I'm doing this through classes or through short research projects. We go through a design cycle, we do all this good work, we follow good process, we maybe create one app, and hopefully the partner uses it. And then we go back to ground zero and say, okay, new problem. All right, we got something for eviction court. Now let's look at divorce court. What can we build? Okay, we only have resources to build one thing, maybe an app or a website or a new training module. Let's build that, hand it off. Okay, back to ground zero. What's a new thing we can build? So we're not being that focused on outcomes. Instead, it's about focused on single projects. So here's where I see there's enormous potential to have a better network around this. But through that Groundhog Day loop, we have learned things. And so I want to just, again, establish a little baseline of what we already know about what people need from the legal system, where there's key opportunities, how we can be assessing things in the legal system, and some common patterns. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I'm happy to talk about them more later. So from talking and testing and building alongside people in the legal system about what kind of tech innovations they want, here are some of the main themes that we're hearing. Probably no surprise to those of you who have worked in this sector. A lot of fear and stress, a desire to be strategic, to be competent, and to be focused. Give me tools that help me do that. Also a huge lack of trust in the system and of lawyers in general. A feeling of lack of control when they're dealing with a civil justice issue, and a feeling of isolation, stress, and guilt. What they want from new technologies and new innovations, here are some 3 big themes. It's about control. So give me something that helps me understand what's happening to me. Give me a clear overview of what my choices are. Don't overload me with too much of those choices. And then tell me, if I choose one of those paths, what will happen to me in the future? Can you give me that type of diagnostic tool? Another mandate that we're hearing from folks is something that's responsive. So oftentimes people in the justice system try to follow the path. They file something or send in an email to the legal aid group or call a hotline, and then no one responds. And this is a common problem with civil justice right now, is that it's not responsive. So we need systems that can immediately tell people whether what they've done is correct or not, whether they're on path or not, and that keeps them moving along more quickly. And the other big thing that we're hearing is, give me a legal service that reads my mind, because I can't put into words what's happening. I need something that can help me form those words, get it across to you, and help me speak this other language, speak this other legal dialect that I can't do. So this is some of the user requirements that we should be stepping up and fulfilling in this innovation community. We also know, sorry for the craziness, I can share it in a more digestible form, but this is my notebook, of what tasks we need to be building technology to solve. So I think this reflects the other access to justice pathways that were mentioned in the earlier presentations, but we need to have tools that can fit each of these functions that people and that service providers are going through. We know that we need to be helping them understand if they have an issue, understand their options, deploy a strategy, participate in the process, negotiate and have difficult conversations, and make sure that their outcomes, they actually understand them. So what is the type of technology or the type of intervention that can help support them along that whole journey? Because right now, most of the apps we're building are helping them maybe at one point, but then they fall off, and getting through that whole journey is the real goal. So how do we build a new type of intervention that goes through them through all of those different functions? When we talk about measuring, these are the things that I think we should be measuring when we look at a new technology or innovation tool. Are they helping people discover what's out there, what help materials exist? Are they helping them engage with them in a meaningful way? Do they actually help people understand what's happening? Do they help them deploy and actually put this information into action? And do they help them follow through and actually participate in the process? And the other level of outcomes that we should be measuring for is justice, both in terms of procedural justice, a sense of dignity and respect when they're going through the entire process and system, and then substantive justice. So whether people are getting fair participation and whether the outcomes are moving them towards or away from poverty outcomes. So what we've seen among all of this work, all of these labs, all of these things, is a tremendous explosion of interesting data gathering, applications, new types of services. Many of them have been mentioned before. So medical legal partnerships, online texting services, better designed forms and applications, new types of digital guides, new types of data that can inform policy making about this. Even in the left-hand corner, a little constitutional rights guide that talks aloud to you in whatever language you choose from. There's lots of really interesting innovations happening, and I'm sure we can talk more about them individually. But like I've said before, what is the impact of all of these one-off innovations, these one-off applications or better form designs or tech products. So that's where I have these 3 big points I want to make. So the first one is about moving away from the My Brilliant App model to something that looks more like our strategic blueprint. So the My Brilliant App model, I don't know, does this resonate with any of you already before I say? How many of you have built a brilliant app that people should have used but maybe didn't use or that ended up in some kind of compost heap? Because as a teacher in a justice lab at a law school, I have a pile of probably 60 apps from wonderful past well-meaning student projects where they have come up and spent 18 weeks or less in developing a new tool to help people understand their rights or to make a claim. And maybe the partner actually does implement them, but it doesn't help people through that complicated journey that I was talking about. And that's where we need to be investing more of our resources, is not in building one-off apps that helps on a single function in that journey, but something that's coordinated and make sure that the person is supported throughout it. So that's my charge to us, is can we get our act together that maybe Tanina at Georgetown can take one part of that her students can build an app that helps people see the options they have when they're facing eviction, and that my team at Stanford can then take that data and those users and help them actually fill in forms and make claims, and someone else can help them submit evidence to court and know how to speak to the judge. But why aren't we coordinating to make sure that we're having that full coverage of the journey? So what could be better in this My Brilliant App world is that we have common best practices, we have data standards, and we have mechanisms where we're evaluating our work to see if we're really being effective, and that we're honest with ourselves and with each other. Also, that we develop more long-term partnerships with courts and other legal aid groups, that we can have more types of interventions that we're testing and empirical evaluation of them, and that we look at the full journey instead of the single moment as places for intervention. So back to that map, like I was saying, can we build something or a series of somethings that takes people all the way along that journey? So this is a little story from Arizona. And it's not mine, it's actually one of my brilliant students, Daniel Bernal, who just graduated from the law school at Stanford. And he was obsessed about why so many tenants in Pima County, Arizona, were not showing up to housing court. They were getting a letter in the mail saying that they were going to be evicted, that the hearing was in 5 days, and so few people were actually showing up to court. And if they showed up to court, they would most likely get some kind of benefit. Maybe not staying in their house, but maybe access to emergency funds, maybe more support or leniency from the judge, maybe a way to mask that eviction so it didn't show up on their credit report. But people weren't even showing up to participate in the process in the first place. So our partnership with the court was structured as such that we weren't only going to design what they wanted, which was a new website. And this is often what happens in these innovation relationships. A court or an organization is open to it if there's a specific payoff, something that looks good for their PR. We said, we will give you a website, we'll build you that website that you think will be valuable, but only if you let us explore that full journey. Only if you let us not just look at that self-help, helping people fill in an answer, but give us full access to possibly changing how housing court works. So we're still in negotiations. We actually found a better partner in Cincinnati, Ohio, but at least the Arizona partnership helped us establish a suite of interventions. So we're changing the actual document that the court sends to people to notify them of the eviction. So hopefully it will be more actionable and people will understand when to go, where to go, all of that information. Sending out new know your rights and encouragement to give people a sense of confidence and empowerment that if they go, they will avoid all these bad outcomes. We're building that website. Courts want a website, so we'll try a website. We've had very little luck in people actually coming to the website, so I echo the concern that legal help and putting things online is going to be the panacea. And we also started a text message reminder program to help people have procedural guidance as they show up, maybe even during the hearing as they're talking to the judge. So we're thinking about this full suite. Ideally, we want to add even more stuff to that journey. We want to add changes to the court rules about what kind of evidence is admitted, how judges are trained to speak to litigants who are self-represented, that we can talk about having more emergency funds and policy relief, but trying to change that kind of single intervention to a full suite of help. And this is where I'm very excited about the notion of having more partnerships that allow for different types of testing, that we don't think that building a single application will solve it all, but instead we're thinking across the full pyramid that I showed you before, and we're having multiple interventions. And this is the idea of living labs, which comes out of smart cities and resiliency and environmental types of policy innovation. I think we should be importing that notion into the world of legal aid, that we can convince courts, especially those that need innovation, to let researchers and innovation groups come in and test out a full range of solutions and do small-scale randomized control testing or other valid empirical testing to see what works, what gets people to show up, what gets them to comprehend what their rights are, what gets them to submit correct evidence to the judge, what gets them to stay in their house, so that we can get a lot more data more quickly. So here's where I'm very excited in this particular charge, to develop more of these living lab partnerships, convincing courts to allow for a lot of small-scale testing and interventions, that we can create these design suites so that maybe in 5 years we have a standard what housing court, at least in the US, should look like. Here are the 10 different technologies that you should have implemented, or here's how you should be training your judges, that we have that relatively standardized. And that we in this room who are working in access to justice innovation are talking to each other, standardizing our data and tech practices, and sharing our code bases so that we are not replicating our efforts so much. Okay, does anyone want to say anything before I go on to the next point? It's a lot of talking. Anything? Okay. Charge 2. So this is really reflecting back on Dame Hazel's point. Why aren't we putting our services where people already are and where there's already trust? Because the issue I see here, and my groups are, and myself are just as guilty as anyone else in this room, of developing things and saying, hey, pay attention over here. We have a new website. Or hey, we built this new guide to traffic court. Don't you guys want to use it so that you can protect yourself in traffic court? I built a new website. Sure, everybody, I'm sure, will come and find this new website online. And the answer is no. People are busy shopping, praying, hanging out with their friends, going to school, taking care of all other parts of their life. They are not proactively going to seek out legal help or new legal websites. And I think we have to stop designing and creating with this notion that we're going to be able to change people's behaviors. I think this is one of the fundamental problems with our current innovation system. So how do we start to think about deploying our resources to leverage existing trusted networks in local communities and especially online? I think this is the big untapped place to get people's attention, get them resources, and onboard them into civil justice is on online platforms. So first, let me talk about offline. So this is a project in Pensacola, Florida, that I was lucky enough to be a part of. The Florida Bar Foundation ran it in the year 2017. So it was held, so Pensacola is right on the border of Alabama, so a part of Florida in the Panhandle, a military town, very religious, very underfunded when it comes to social services. So a local nonprofit that had a storefront in the middle of a big housing estate said, hey, a lot of folks in our neighborhood have legal problems because they're just coming out of jail and they need to get their driver's license, deal with child custody, basically get set up so that they don't reoffend and end up back incarcerated. What can we do to get more lawyers or to get more legal help to these folks who are reentering and their community, their grandmas, their wives, their girlfriends? So we had a year-long process to figure out what could we do to get more of these folks who are coming out of the prison system to connect with lawyers. And surprise, surprise, they don't want to go into legal aid offices. They don't want to go into the court system. They don't want to go near government services having just come out of jail. So we had a lot of in-person events right in their community. And we had folks who were 3 months away from being released from jail come and join us at our design sessions. So we had legal aid group folks, we had actually police officers and jail officers there, church leaders, as wide a community net as we could get from Pensacola. And we had the people themselves tell us what they needed, what they wanted, and where they would go to get that help. So we had them draw on the map of where should we put lawyers, where should we put legal help. And we had them tell us whether they would use technology, what kind of technology they would use, and had them actually design us new applications or new tools. And then when we came up, our design team came up with, okay, here's what we heard from you, and here are the 3 big ideas we think that you want. We had them basically vote us down and up to tell us, actually, don't ever build that, we will not use it. What they wanted actually was more services right after church services. So Thursday night in Pensacola is when everyone is going to church. The lawyers should come right after service ends and hang out when there's donuts and chocolate milk and coffee. Like, put lawyers there, or put them in the McDonald's, put them in the Starbucks. But don't make me go down to downtown to sit in a waiting area. So what we ended up proposing, what the community wanted, was a mix of high tech and very low tech. So the high tech part of it was an AI bot that would live on any intake referrals in any intake system. So whether it was a social services, an educational institution, a medical thing, this would be a little bot that would watch that non-lawyer's case notes and say, hey, your client seems to have a legal problem, let's refer them over to a legal aid lawyer. So something that would be a kind of AI scouter for legal referrals. People were comfortable with that they could be at another place and be told that they had a legal problem and should get a legal aid lawyer. The other things people wanted were justice on the block, so having these legal aid lawyers posted where they already were at, and a one-stop life shop. So to have these community events, maybe once every 3 months, where all of the services that a person coming out of jail would need would be co-located and expedited, and maybe even fees reduced. So over the course of a year, we prototyped and deployed and did test runs of all 3 of these to mixed success, but at least we tried, with the smart AI working the most reliably because the least amount of community members were needed to make that happen. But the more community intensive ones turned out to be quite successful as well, especially the one-stop life shop. Justice on the block, the hardest part was getting enough pro bono lawyers to staff it. So getting the lawyers out of their offices turns out to be harder than we expected. But I want to say that we can invest in these in-person community outreach pieces, but we also need to be investing in the digital places where people are and where they have trust. So at the same time as we should be building more medical legal partnerships, community places where lawyers are, where we need to be training more people on how to scout legal help, the other world is in building new bots, AI, and digital infrastructure so that when people are presenting their problems online, we're getting them to high-quality legal information. So let me tell you one other story. This is one that we're working on at Stanford. That's my big passion project these days. It's how people are using Google and other online platforms to try to find answers to their legal help queries. So when I'm doing surveys or asking people about how they go online, they go online to figure out a diagnosis. What's my issue? What are my options? What should I be doing? And who can help me? So the basic access to justice trajectory, they're looking on Google and other places for these answers. What they get, if they get to a legal help site, is something that is relatively well designed. It's presentable. This is our California legal help portal. So you can go and find a list of resources or a list of organizations who help with housing law in California, or the same thing with immigration. Or they might end up at the courts and they can see a PDF attachment that tells them when they can come and wait in line at the self-help center. So it's helpful information. It gives them the basics on services, but it doesn't actually answer their questions. They want a diagnosis. They want something custom. They don't want a general list of opening hours or know your rights information. Especially on Google search, though, most people don't end up at a court website or a legal aid website. If you search, at least in the US, about, I got an eviction notice, what do I do? Most of what you get is advertisements or crowdsourced knowledge. So you get a lot of law firms who are, even if they don't want to serve this low end of the market, are still promoting themselves and spending a lot of money on ad buys to be featured very prominently. Also, there's no jurisdiction sensitivity in Google. So you will get in a California search information from Australia or Maine or Florida or anywhere that's actually invested in building good websites. Those websites figure first because of how Google ranks things. So people are not getting correct referrals at the Google search results page. Or people go to Reddit. They go to places where they already trust folks and they can ask a ton of people if they've had similar problems. And maybe you've gone to Reddit. Is anyone here a Reddit user? Okay. So Reddit, you can go, you can post about your story or your problem and see what the crowd thinks. Has anyone had a similar problem to you? Do they have any advice for you? So the legal advice subreddit is really active, and it's moderated by lawyers, so there's a somewhat good chance that you might get something useful. But honestly, I would consider this a low-quality information environment, where you have a lot of people giving you a lot of noise to a pretty urgent life problem that you're going through. So I was inspired by a project that a Dutch law student, who's only 20 years old, came up with. So she's a law student / computer scientist named Nora Al Hyder. And she's a big Reddit user, and she was on Reddit relationship board, which is not legal at all, but people complaining about their boyfriends or husbands or girlfriends or wives, and about their relationship problems. And she was seeing that there was lots of legal potential there, whether it's about domestic violence restraining orders or about divorce or child custody, that a lot of the relationship discussions actually has huge legal potential for help to be effective. So her idea that she deployed and built quite quickly was a Reddit divorce bot. So she built a little bot that whenever people are mentioning the word divorce on the Reddit site, she looks at about what jurisdiction they're writing from, and she got a master list of all the legal help state portals, the official legal aid groups, websites from the states. And she has a little bot that very helpfully says, hey, it seems like you're in Mississippi talking about divorce. Here's the official legal aid website that you can go explore, and here's their divorce page. So not trying to answer their question, not trying to be their lawyer, but at least get them out of that low quality information place and get them to a higher quality, so at least they can know and use their rights. So this was inspiring for me. What if we could get people where they already are talking about their problems and channel them into a better justice system experience? So this is where the data and AI building comes in. So over the past year, with the help of Pew Charitable Trusts and partners at another university, Suffolk Law School, we have been gathering all of these stories of people's legal problems on Reddit. We have about 80,000 posts. Reddit makes it freely available, so I encourage you to research with Reddit. And we have a crowd of law students and lawyers who read through these stories and say yes or no about whether certain types of legal issues are present or not. So for example, I've been living in my apartment nearly 2 years. After I moved in, there was a leak in my ceiling that damaged my mattress beyond repair. My landlord grudgingly paid me to replace it, though angrily told me I could replace it, blah, 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 blah. So we have law students, lawyers read through these and then say yes or no. Is a family law issue present here? Is a housing law? Is a work and employment? Is a disabilities and benefits? This produces a labeled data set, which is the magic thing to build new AI tools. Because the raw data is great, interesting, maybe you can do some research about legal needs on it, but you can't train AI tools. So with all of this gameplay of law students and lawyers pressing check or X, come play, we need more labelers, we can build AI, natural language processing classifiers, which are little bots that we can send back out on Reddit or anywhere else where people are writing about their life stories, and they can automatically say whether those legal issues are present or not. And we're getting to pretty high levels of accuracy. So our little bot can read all of these stories, and right now it's at a pretty high level of categorization. There seems to be a housing law issue present here. There seems to be a work and employment or a consumer law issue here. But gradually we're training it in more specific, so we can talk about eviction from a public housing unit or divorce with child custody issue. And as we get more specific, we can make better referrals or more clear information offerings. So in the near future, we could build bots that are living on Twitter, on Reddit, on Facebook, or any other social media platform where people are talking in their own language about their life problems. And we could hopefully, not annoyingly, tell them, hey, we think you might have a legal issue. Do you want to come on over into legal aid world, into court world, and see what you could do about it? We've been testing these. People actually hate it on Twitter. People are not looking for legal aid bots to come help them on Twitter. They see it as creepy and spammy. But on Reddit, we see higher levels of trust, and we can test this more. The highest potential, though, as we learn how people's words and phrases and stories translate into legal issues and how we as lawyers classify things, is on the Google search results page. This is my big life's mission, is to get that search results page in every country and every jurisdiction, to be jurisdiction correct, to have actionable information, to be really clear. And so just to geek out a little bit, schema.org markup is the information that websites can have on the back end that tells Google or Bing or Yahoo or Yandex what's actually on that page. And if we can get a network of us to actually mark up the existing websites, we can have much better search results. We can have, instead of a bunch of ads and other kind of junk on a Google search results page, we can have what the medical community already has invested in, which is clear, actionable guidance that tells you, okay, it seems that you're asking about an eviction notice. Here is your local Pennsylvania law help. If you're not in Pennsylvania, tell us what jurisdiction you are in. Here are the things to do that you should do immediately. Here are the official providers that you can go to. Here's the court site so that you know the rules of the court. How do we get that clear, actionable information right to people? So I've been working on a partnership with Google that would let us do this. But the first part of it is getting more legal aid groups and courts on board to say that this is worthwhile. So I'm excited that this might actually happen. Any questions now before I move to my third and shorter point? I'm almost done, I promise. Yeah, please, Natalie.
I just wondered, if you're creating these data sets, and obviously with really good intent for targeting legal information and support at people, what are the safeguards that need to be put in place as you're doing this to ensure that it's not used by, for example, claims management companies or people who want to use the same and do you know if private companies who might have an interest in targeting people with products that might not be as ethically sound are doing this type of work?
So to the second point, no, I don't know if any private for-profit companies are trying to identify, though of course we can tell from ad buys. So we can see that people are clearly buying ads that are offering either spammy or low-quality services to folks who are searching about immigration or other types of queries. So we know that there are a lot of these groups who want to persuade people to come on to their service world, to come into their company. There can always be a dark side to any kind of AI product. That there are for-profit companies that want to be able to target and sell advertisements and onboard. But I would assume that behind closed doors, they are doing the same type of targeting research, if not AI building. I can't say that for sure. But I would say that that's not a reason to stop us in the access to justice community from doing it. And we have an open access mission in ours, so everything that we're building, our data sets, our classifiers, we're putting on GitHub, we're making available. But maybe we should think about these types of ethical or concerning ways that good, open, access-oriented things could be stopped. We should talk more about regulation or review about these things. Yeah, okay. Anything else? All right, I'll move to my third charge, which, oh, please.
Kristen Hope from Terre des Hommes. Just to pick up on that point also, and actually on a comment that you made earlier in your presentation, which was about, I actually have it here, which is essentially about how people need a combination of online and offline because obviously they want the service to reflect their real-life trusted communities. I think there's also an assumption here, and the organization I work with works in access to justice for children and young people, and I think there's an assumption also when we think about what is a trusted community that we tend to think that might be offline. But what we're seeing, there's a really important emerging research from people like Sonia Livingston at the LSE talking about the ways in which the digital world and children growing up in a digital world actually constitutes and comprises their identity as much and as validly as what happens in an offline world. And so essentially if we look at what trying to provide services to vulnerable children, children in conflict with the law or in contact with the law as victims, I think we have to be taken into consideration, how people are formed in the online world. And on that point, there's also some really interesting research that's coming out around what are children's most pressing online concerns and how that has been evolving over time. So a website called Super Awesome, which is based here in the UK, is doing research with children and young people. And about 5 years ago, the most pressing online concerns for children were things like cyberbullying and things around being a victim of more abuse online. Now, the most recent data is saying that actually children are much more concerned with things like data protection, with things like being scammed, being hacked. And so I think it's really important to take these things into consideration, and particularly when we think about the group of people who may be children now, who are growing up to be young adults, and we know people who are in conflict with the law or in contact with the law are also exposed, or, growing up into this adult world. And so how are we also taking into consideration those lived realities, which are in this process of flux, and thinking about those ethical questions like trust, like community, and how those notions evolve in an online space? Thanks.
I think this is a really interesting point, and talk about skating to where the puck is going to be. How do we start designing for, I'm old millennial, I'm just at the cusp. I was born in 1981, so I can call myself a millennial, but there's definitely this new era of young people who it's not easy to research them. They're not in the courts, like they're not at the places we usually do our research. And that's what we're finding actually with the Reddit data set, is at the same time as we're building AI, we're also realizing that there's a huge way to do new types of legal needs research about what are people's needs, at least as of 2018 in the Reddit focus group community. But these online places where data lives can be a way that we in the legal aid and court community can better understand our users by understanding, first of all, what are the major needs that they have, which maybe don't correspond to our current services. So on Reddit, we see a huge amount of concern about revenge porn, about online small business issues, about copyright and protection. We see obviously a lot about our standard things around debt and housing, divorce, custody, but there's a whole range of other issues that we don't have standard issue codes or services for in our legal services. But then also to understand how people talk about things, what they trust. How do we start using these digital platforms to do this type of research at a much larger scale? I think there's an interesting potential at the same time as realizing privacy and ethical concerns. So to be talked about more. Okay, there's the final big area that I'm very excited about is more work not just on programmatic innovation, but on policy innovation at the same time. Because here the big gap I see are between those of us in civil justice who are working on changing the rules and the policies. So what in US, one of the big things is right to counsel in civil cases. So getting people lawyers when they're facing housing or other problems, changing rules of court, creating new possible regulations around unauthorized practice of law. And they're relatively divided from those of us, I would consider myself on the right hand of this, thinking about really more of the mundane, small, or technical things. So how we set up our IT systems, what the day-to-day service design of a court or a legal aid group looks like, how we train our judges or clerks, how we create documents and forms. These two groups should be communicating and collaborating together to get to that higher quality reform. So, because what I see here, like for example, with right to counsel, New York City and San Francisco both just had this policy change. So now people who are facing eviction can get a free lawyer. But what's missing is actual legal mundanity, all those small things about how we let people know they actually have this right, how they can find a lawyer within 5 days, get a counseling session, create a strategy, gather evidence, show up to court. Once we have the right on the books, we need to think about all of this service design to actually make it meaningful. Otherwise, the data is going to be pretty miserable about the effect that this right has on access to justice. So how do we actually link these things? Because oftentimes the policies get put in place, we think job done, but there's this whole other place about implementation and all of those details. The second area I think we need to concentrate on is having the same tech design approach, experimentation, community-driven participatory work, brought to policy reform. So how we actually create new types of regulators and regulatory environments that allow for experimentation, that allow for gathering of data and seeing what works and what doesn't in terms of the rules that are governing courts and lawyers. And at the same time, as we see more of these regulatory sandboxes and innovation zones, how do we encourage traditional access to justice actors like legal aid groups, self-help centers, other folks who are generally not part of those conversations to join in and offer new types of services and business models into the marketplace? So let me tell you one short story to illustrate this. So I'm working with the Supreme Court of Utah, which technically is the regulator of legal services in the state of Utah, though they've given that power to the Bar Association. They're thinking about taking it back. So we're in the middle of proposing a regulatory sandbox in the state of Utah that would fundamentally change how legal professionals and possibly court rules are regulated. So the regulatory sandbox, can I just see a show of hands? How many people know what that means? Okay. It mainly comes from financial technology regulators. So in the UK, you have a pretty substantial regulatory sandbox in fintech. It's been happening in Singapore, Australia, many other countries, especially in fintech, but not so far in legal tech or legal services. The basic idea with a regulatory sandbox is that especially for new emerging technologies or innovations, we need not to regulate them through a controlled list of rules, as we typically do with legal profession, but instead we let the innovators say, actually, if we could get rid of unauthorized practice of law, I could offer this new service into the market, and I will gather data about how this new service performs. I'll gather data on what harms it might produce to the public. I'll gather data on what benefits it might produce to the public. And you, regulator, I'll share that data with you. You can audit me. You can see how I'm performing. You can see how risky or not I am. But if you relax these rules, I can offer this new thing that will promote better public outcomes. So this is a different type of regulation. It's risk-based rather than rules-based, where we're looking at outcomes, what actually helps people versus harms people. And it lets us also evolve what our regulatory system looks like. And it's not through big, drastic changes. It's through actual experimentation and empirical proof that a certain type of regulation allows for more benefit versus harm. So the idea of the sandbox is to run this in small classes, maybe 10 or 15 new innovators approach the regulator and say, we want this rule, and that rule to be relaxed. We'll offer this innovation, and you can gather data on us, and we'll gather data to see what happens. If they act unethically or they're harming more than helping, they can get kicked out of the sandbox, and they lose their license to offer this service. But if it turns out, if the data shows that they're helping people more than harming them, they can stay in the sandbox, and they can continue to offer the service. So we're really excited that this will pass through in Utah. We'll see more this summer. But if it does, I think there'll be many other states in the US who are interested in offering these new types of sandboxes to stimulate a wider market of people serving middle class and hopefully lower income folks. But that's one of the big questions is I think we have a lot of interest from regulators, bars and Supreme Courts in the US about creating these innovation zones, about opening regulatory sandboxes. The question is, will access to justice-oriented actors join these sandboxes, or will it only be startups or law firms or people who are looking at the more middle class or upper class parts of the market? So this is something I think we in the access to justice community really need to start thinking about. What are those new business models? What are those new innovation things that we could be offering so that as these new regulatory schemes open up, we're ready to join them and test out our new ideas? Okay? So basically that's the end of my talk. I'll just say that I'm really interested in setting a short-term vision where we think about in 3 years what we want to say we've accomplished. Some of the things I want to have accomplished is have these coordinated blueprints of the housing court of 2022 or the debt court of 2022, what those new technologies that we should have in place in most all courts should be. That we have better Google search results page, my personal bugaboo, that we have more interesting and scaled up training of community advocates, and that we have regulatory sandboxes in play, but that are very much access to justice focused. So those are my wishes for the future. I'm very happy to take questions and talk more, but that's the end from me.
Hi, I just wanted to pick up the point on sandboxes. So I'm Emma Tunley from the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and here with a colleague from Nesta. So we do have a sandbox in legal services, exactly along the model that you outlined. So we've learnt from fintech. So just to say, if any lawyers in the room want to talk to tech companies, come and talk to us about our sandbox. As I said, we're here with Nicola today. We were lucky to secure funding from the government, exactly in sort of the anticipatory regulation sphere. So I think the UK, are very forward-thinking in this area. Nicola's speaking at one of the sessions this afternoon. So if you want to come and hear more about our access to justice challenge that we're working to basically look forward and look at how regulation needs to be in the future to work with ethical issues in AI. So if anybody wants to come and learn more, Nicola's here, Warren's here from the SRA as well, and we've got Alison, I think, somewhere in the room as well.
Thank you. And there's also another session this afternoon with Fiona McClay, who's our Legal Services Commissioner from Australia, who'll be talking about legal sandboxes in more detail. Is it William? Matthew, sorry.
Hi, Matthew Burnett with Open Society Foundations. So Margaret and I actually had our own Einstein experience about 6 years ago, where she was on a panel I was moderating and couldn't make it at the last minute and sent me her slides to present. So I looked brilliant, but there was no Einstein in the back of the room, unfortunately, to help. One of the things that I'm really interested in coming out of the public health context is this problem of diffusion, and particularly the ways in which innovations can in fact exacerbate inequalities in communities. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, particularly it tends to be where they're related to individual choices and where there aren't meaningful alternatives. And so creating these ecosystems where there's lots of information and advice, but no real meaningful sort of rights protections or procedural opportunities in place to address the actual root issue. What are your thoughts? And there may be sort of regulatory reform that needs to happen to help more robots and human non-lawyers be able to do the work, but interested in kind of what the kind of next sort of beyond getting past your 3 points and really understanding what that ecosystem might look like.
I don't have the perfect answer to that question. I think I'm also concerned with more online dispute resolution and online courts. I can see that we're going to have very well-meaning information where we'll tell people, here are the key things you should know as you're going into this negotiation room, or here are your rights, make sure you protect them. That is not going to be read or translated into action. Like, we know from many user testing sessions that people can't operationalize general advice when they're actually having negotiation or difficult conversations or going into these hearing-like online zones. So there we can think about, yes, is there regulation that puts safeguards in? Are there AI or in-person assistants who can be giving that counsel? Because I think that's one of the things I'm most worried about, is that due process and need for strategic counsel in this online channel where people are most likely going to probably feel a sense of procedural justice on these online platforms because they're satisfying, they're responsive. It seems that they work, but I think my hunch is that people are not going to be able to effectively protect their rights without some type of intentional intervention that gives them that strategic advice. We need to experiment more about what that can be, or if there needs to be safeguard about some kind of counsel being given, because I think disclosures, giving people text or things are not going to be effective.
Margaret, if you don't mind, we just have one more from Fiona here.
Oh.
Just a quick question. Perhaps Richard might have some thoughts on this as well. I'm the regulator of lawyers in Victoria in Australia, and we're just about to set up a innovation sandbox stolen from the SRA. As we've been doing the work to set that up, talking with lawyers, one of the things that has struck us is that it is not necessarily regulation itself that is stopping innovation, but something about the nature of lawyers. So I think they are very risk averse, they're very anxious, they're not very creative, they're not particularly strategic, and so they think of a whole lot of reasons why something can't be done. And so I'm curious about what you think about that, how we might do something about that. It's not limited to the for-profit legal world. I see the same thing in very passionate access to justice lawyers as well. So what do you think about that from the student end? And Richard, I guess you kind of have a whole of profession view on this for a long period of time.
Yeah. So I would say we had a mini Who Will Enter the Sandbox workshop at Stanford back in April, where we tried to get legal aid groups, startups, big law firms, anyone who wanted to come in. Matthew was there and said, if we had a sandbox, would you come, or what ideas would you have? Legal aid groups mainly didn't want to come. They didn't think it was for them, or if they did come, it was very deferential to the tech innovators in the room. So that's my prediction, is if we open sandboxes, it will be the techies among us and not those who necessarily are best poised to expand on their current services to better tech-oriented ones. My hunch is that we need explicit training, fellowships, these kind of programs that bring people along and offer this as a professional development and get them ready, basically incubate them to bring them into a sandbox model. So it's a little bit about that mindset change. So increasingly, I'm seeing more legal aid folks and self-help folks in the States who have the mindset switch. They just need that capabilities or teammates to help them understand the possibilities of AI. But they're hungry. We want to use AI. How can we use AI? AI will be good. So how do we give them the partnerships that will let them get out of magical thinking into more practical thinking and get them ready to have a product that could actually succeed in the sandbox? So probably it means more money and coaching, but there's something there.
Do you think the next generation of lawyers, there's more hope for more creativity and
I would say so. I think a lot of my graduating law students want to start new types of scalable low bono models. What they're missing is the years of practice and oftentimes that tech partner. So we need to find a way to do these matchmaking sessions where we can get like the real legal aid subject matter experts with the young energetic folks and tech expertise.
Richard?
Yes, thank you. Some of you may know I wrote a book with my son on the future of the professions, and we looked at 8 different professions. And the good news is we're not the most conservative profession. It turns out the clergy are more... But it is true that lawyers are quite reluctant to change and not particularly open to change. I often point to 2 things. One is what I call irrational rejectionism, which I define as the dogmatic dismissal of a technology with which they have no personal experience. Really common. You mention something to a lawyer, there's no way they've been exposed to it, and yet they already think it's a bad idea. The second related point is, and it's part of our training, is the tendency to go immediately for the negative side of any proposals. And that relates a little bit to what I was saying about transcendentalism and comparativism earlier. But my answer to all of this, and to some extent I think it bears on what was a very great talk, thanks very much, is that lawyers are far more convinced by evidence than by argument. And so if you're trying to convince them and attract them, this is why I'm so very much looking forward to you hearing Shannon's talk, when you actually hear what's been done as a matter of fact, it's far harder to argue against that than, for example, with my stuff, where I'm putting forward arguments for which every lawyer can put a plausible counter-argument. So I think it's very important in the community you're mentioning that there's overwhelming evidence of benefit, because that, I think, takes the discussion to a different level.
Thank you.